This video is a sample lesson of the Entrypoint Academy project, which introduces the Entrypoint philosophy, a way to navigate and live in the reality of the 21st century. In this lesson, I want to introduce you to the work of Plato in the way that I have been discovering it myself and how Plato's work has contributed to me living in the reality of the 21st century and has led me on a journey to create Entrypoint Academy. The lesson is divided into several segments, so it suits to everyone according to their interest and time. When I heard of Plato during my lifetime, I knew that Plato was a Greek philosopher, that he was somehow connected to Socrates, who kept on asking strange questions. I knew that Socrates said, "All I know is that I know nothing." I also knew the term Platonic love and understood the meaning of the term Plato's gave. That is how it's been till I was 45 years old. Since I am a former politician, former advisor to the Czech cabinet office, and I ran a number of national-wide election campaigns, I had a chance to work closely with top politicians, cabinet members here and abroad. I have come to the conclusion over time, which I have published many times, that our world is not in a situation when various politicians and influential players play 4D chess, but that the opposite is true. The political system is ran by incompetent people. The reason for this is that in fact we and other countries that have a system of democratic elections choose only according to the degree of sympathy for a given candidate. This logically leads to the fact that we elect the likable people who, unfortunately, are not capable of running the countries. Of course, I am not saying this just based on the media, but based on my direct experience with my clients here in the Czech Republic and abroad. When I said this one day to my friend Vladimir, a thoughtful and a very well-read lawyer, he said to me, "Well, this is a classic Plato's boat." I was so intrigued by this that I set out on a journey to my first Platonic dialogue, the Republic, to see if it were possible that what I was thinking and experiencing with my clients could have been formulated 2,400 years ago. I gazed in amazement when reading the Republic that I was reading work written 400 years before Christ. When in my head I removed the scenery of ancient Greece, I was looking at the dialogue of a group of people who were thinking quite seriously about how to create an ideal society, where finally someone takes into account not only what is good for the state, but also for the individual, because the state and the individual are connected by an umbilical cord. Because a happy citizen does not have to steal and lie. Therefore, the primary goal of any politician should be simultaneously develop the state and guide every citizen to earn money to live a happy life. Notice that this ancient knowledge is nowhere to be heard from today's politicians, because a politician is fighting for your sympathy. So they kept on telling you what they are going to do for you and how they are going to spend your tax money, but they will never tell you how to live your life, how to raise your children, that we should improve our skills, learn new languages. We must realize that we must not vote on likability, but on how strongly we believe that a given candidate can drive their agenda. And it's a question of whether, in the course of our everyday work and worries, are we even capable of finding this out? This is something we have seen all over the world during the pandemic, when it became apparent everywhere in the world that at the helm of every country are likable leaders who have never dealt with any crises in their life. And this is exactly how Plato's boat demonstrates that democracy doesn't work. In this analogy, the state is linked to a boat. Imagine that passengers on the ship overthrow the crew and then have to choose a navigator. This leads to individual passengers competing to win the favor of others by trying to appear as likable, dominant, pleasant, trying to fit in with everyone else. Not a true navigator who understands navigation will never be chosen among them, because they take him for a fool. He looks unlikable, and instead of scheming to win the favor of others, he's studying the wind direction, weather, and steering technique. Similarly, in today's society, none of the politicians in their lifetime have actually trained to run a country. People, the nation. No one has been trained in the techniques of explaining their views, attitudes, so that they can convince the unconvinced. None have studied and learned how to run a country in crisis. On the contrary, as in the analogy of Plato's boat, today's politicians who win in the elections are those who are for the majority most likable. They will certainly make a good navigator in times of sunny weather, but in the times of crisis and confusion, they will absolutely fail, just as we saw during the pandemic and continue to see in the context of what is happening today. When I was a lifeguard came in, he had all the certificates, nice tan, big muscles, and beautiful smile. The patrons loved him, but when someone started drowning, he froze and was absolutely useless. Because when a crisis comes, most beautiful and honest candidate is completely useless. I perceived all of this while reading Plato's Republic. I was so taken by it that I subsequently went through about 25 Plato's dialogues, where I discovered dozens and dozens of other insights that have enriched my current personal and professional life immensely. While reading the dialogues and looking up more information, I finally got to know who Plato was, who Socrates was, what was the relationship between Plato and Socrates, what is the detailed and general message of Plato's work, and at the same time I was beginning to see how this work affected me in my everyday life, and moreover, how it fit into the Entrypoint philosophy that I live by, which ultimately led into the concept of Entrypoint Academy. So who was Plato? As you all probably know by now, he was a Greek philosopher who lived 427 to 347 before Christ. Plato was a disciple of Socrates, who lived 470 to 399 BC. Socrates never wrote anything. The only thing we know about Socrates was written by Plato, and there are a few other references to Socrates by other figures writing at the time. But we know for sure that both Plato and Socrates did exist. Plato wrote about 35 dialogues and 13 letters during his lifetime. For the letters, scholars are not sure if the author was really Plato. So what are dialogues? Think of a dialogue as a script where most of the text is direct speech of the characters with occasional mention of what's going on and who's done what. The central character is Socrates, who talks about various topics with various characters in the dialogues. In the Laws, Socrates is absent, but in the Laws, the character of a young Athenian is featured, but he speaks in a way that Socrates would. It is important to note here that each dialogue is thought out in detail. Each character has its own meaning. Each sentence, word, and tone has its own meaning. Dialogues are semi-fiction, except perhaps for the dialogue apology. Dialogues are fiction inspired by real facts and life situations. The characters appearing in the dialogues are often inspired by real characters that definitely existed. Many characters in the dialogues had probably a real-life encounter with Socrates. Plato was probably present at many of these debates, which then Plato most likely used as an inspiration for writing the dialogues. Plato himself does not appear in any of the dialogues except for a mention in the Apology. One scholarly discipline is trying to decipher how much Socrates' views are in the dialogues and how much of these are a mix of Plato's views. It is also not known exactly in what sequence the dialogues were written. The general agreement is that the dialogues are divided into three groups of early dialogues, middle dialogues, and late dialogues. It certainly intrigued me how many scholars researching Plato's work. Here I need to mention, for me, a great mystery. In the course of learning about the world around me, I have of course read the entire Bible. I approach the Bible as a manual to describe to the average person the reality and how to behave in that reality. When I read the Bible, I was surprised at how primitively it was written. It seemed to me like someone talking to me if I were in kindergarten. It seemed to me like a children's history book trying to tell me something terribly important, but something that in the 21st century, in the business meeting in the Czech Republic, was completely useless. The whole story in the Bible strikes me as a linear, one-directional, simple. At most, someone was giving me a big example that Isaiah in the Old Testament was able to predict the coming of Jesus Christ. But that didn't impress me at all in the context that it is absolutely proven today that the entire Bible has been revised and redacted, at the same time that it's actually a collection of different books that somebody decided to link together. In the context of the above, compared to Plato's dialogues, I don't understand how the Bible, a mediocre historical narrative, could beat Plato's work. I take comfort at least in the fact that Plato's work is second only to the Bible as the most influential work on our Western culture. Where the Bible influenced me, however, is in my view of the ancient humans. I begin to think of them as very primitive illiterates who have very different concerns that I have today. And if they were to show up here with me today, I wouldn't really have anything to say to them because they would not be able to understand at all how our society functions and what my problems are. They live in a slaveholder mentality where they are told what to do and think without the option to question anything. That's why I was in absolute awe reading Plato's dialogues. On the first level, I was completely blown away by the sheer humanity that I completely identified with. I mean, even though I was reading a dialogue written 2,400 years ago, it was written in such a way that I felt like that's exactly how the dialogue could have been played out today. When I read The Republic, I felt like I was reading excerpts from various meetings I experienced in my days in politics and with my clients. In all the dialogues, I had a feeling that I had experienced every dialogue in some variation in my life, many times quite literally. When reading the Bible, I didn't have that feeling at all. It was like reading the old Bohemian tales, which are nicely written, but the information in the tales does nothing to help me to pay the bills. This is not at all true of Plato's dialogues. Plato's work must be perceived in a completely different way. Imagine metaphorically each of Plato's dialogue as a house. Each house has a different architecture. Each house has different inhabitants. Each house has a different theme, which is always presented differently. One is about someone talking about something that they saw somewhere. One time it's about someone coming to visit unexpectedly. One time it's about a party going on. One time it's about a serious meeting going on. Imagine knowing that every detail in the house has a hidden meaning. Then you start to look forward to visiting a new house. Another important aspect is that each dialogue house has multiple dimensions. One dimension is what's happening in the center of the action. Socrates talks with someone on the main theme. But around the center dialogue are other details. Each character has its own meaning. Even characters who don't speak and just listen to dialogue have their own meaning. Their role is based on their approach to life and philosophy. Some characters just appear in multiple dialogues. Some characters appear in multiple dialogues. If you don't know the character, if you don't know how a character has behaved in previous dialogues, you miss that dimension. And yet it's all brilliantly written that even though you don't know anything about the character, the main dialogue still makes sense to you. Thus, as you read through the dialogues and learn more about a character that appears more often, they give the dialogues new flavor, and many times you want to go back to the dialogue and read it again. Another dimension is also the historical role of the character in the dialogues. A beautiful example is the dialogue of Charmides, in which Socrates debates Critias and Charmides about temperance. The dialogue itself is remarkable, but the moment you learn that Critias became one of the 30 tyrants who ruled over Athens after the end of Peloponnesian Wars, the whole dialogue takes on a different flavor. The Peloponnesian Wars, which lasted 30 years and affected the lives of Socrates and Plato, add further context not only to the dialogues, but the world view of the Greeks of the time. Each dialogue is therefore in itself a very interesting multidimensional structure that can be read repeatedly over and over, and you will discover, perhaps endlessly, more and more remarkable details. By the time you have gone through several dialogues, you start to discover that the individual houses are connected in various ways. Sometimes it's common characters, sometimes it's continuing plot, sometimes it's a common event. Of course, time plays a big part in the dialogue. Sometimes a dialogue is about what is just happening. Other time, it's about someone telling a story about Socrates' youth. This will give you a background or new information about other dialogues. From these metaphoric houses, a kind of a neighborhood will emerge to stay true to the house analogy. And this neighborhood as a whole makes even more sense than the individual dialogues on their own. Into this, of course, you see that the philosophy of Plato and Socrates is alive and evolving. Plato wrote these dialogues over a period of about 50 years. So Plato's philosophy was evolving, and this evolution is not only seen, but is also acknowledged in the dialogues. A great motif of Plato is the theory of forms, which is continually emerging and evolving, and is evolving throughout the dialogues. Yet in the dialogue Parmenides, which is set in Socrates' youth, the young Socrates with his theory of the forms, gets annihilated by Parmenides. And it's all the more interesting subsequently how Plato deals with these objections in the future dialogues. As I said, if someone told me to bet if the Bible is the work of God and Plato is the work of the man, or vice versa, I would always say that the Bible is the work of man, because I feel that any average writer could write it. Certainly I devised an outline to the plot of the Bible, but to write what Plato did, I would find it inconceivable for myself, and therefore I would always say that Plato's work is the work of God. I will now tell you the main reason for this assertion of mine. The Bible and the other books of this type are mostly written in a style, do this, do that. It's so because God wants it, don't ask. This leaves you in a frame of mind where you have a list of do's and don'ts, commandments that you have to follow. Most of the wisdom that I have read in the Bible has not impressed me, has not given me anything, and did not enhance my life in the 21st century. It did not help my life at all. With Plato's work, however, I have experienced something completely different in my own mind. It's not just my subjective feeling, but it's an effect that is generally described by scholars of Plato. And from my point of view, it's a completely divine effect. Plato is not telling us through his dialogues and the whole dialogue neighborhood that things are this way or that way or do this or that. Plato's dialogue show you a way to think about things in life, how to question, but not that he's telling you how to ask, but he's showing you how Socrates asks. He's subliminally teaching you to ask and look at the world. Here I must mention the term dialectics. I don't understand how I can be 45 years old and I have never heard the term. Never. I've never seen a course on dialectics. I've never seen anyone who consciously practices dialectics. Yet it's a method of gradually dissecting a topic, options and situations through questioning. It's not a discussion, it's not arguing. It's a way of getting together through questions and answers to move forward together. One could say that every dialogue is an example of dialectics. There are no rules and laws of dialectic summed anywhere in the dialogues, but through reading the dialogues, you learn to think and apply dialectics. You, without even knowing, learn to approach life situations and interactions with people in a completely different way through dialectics. I begin to feel this in my own life, in business meetings, when you negotiate with a client, when communicating with a colleague or a family member. I will also discuss dialectics in detail in the last segment. As I mentioned earlier, some dialogues are more connected, some are less connected, but there are dialogues that go in sequence. Let's discuss these main lines of dialogues in general. Socrates lived in Athens. In fact, in all the dialogues, Socrates is always in Athens except for two exceptions. In the dialogue Phaedrus, Socrates goes with Phaedrus outside of walls of Athens. And in the dialogue The Republic, he walks through the harbor of Piraeus. As Socrates lived, he met various persons with whom he had a dialogue, or rather dialectic encounter, in the style that when somebody came along and said, I know this, or I know this for sure, or I know this so well that for some of my intellectual skills I'm making a lot of money, Socrates would start questioning them in front of other participants, and through questioning, Socrates would show that the person doesn't actually know what they are talking about. This, of course, led to a lot of people hating Socrates. This leads to Socrates being accused of impiety and corruption of the youth. In the dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates comes to the local government office overseeing piety. In front of the government office, he meets Euthyphro, who is leaving the office where he has just filed a lawsuit against his father for impiety, and this whole dialogue revolves around what piety is. The dialogue that follows is logically the apology. In this dialogue, Socrates is already facing Athenian jury of some 500 people before whom Socrates defends himself against the charges that he's corrupting the young and being impious. Socrates loses this trial and he is sentenced to death by drinking poison. The apology dialogue is probably the most authentic dialogue because the dialogue was published at a time when it could be read by those who were present at Socrates' trial. In the following dialogue, Crito visits Socrates in prison. Crito is a friend of Socrates who comes to say that an escape route has been prepared and that Socrates can escape from the prison, subsequently from Athens. Socrates, again after a wonderful dialectic and dissection of justice, responsibility, and the duty to bear the punishment, refuses to escape. In the dialogue Phaedo, which takes place in the moments before Socrates is to drink the poison, Socrates discusses the human soul and whether there is or is not life after death. This, I would say, is one multiple dialogue storyline. Another plot line that I found very intriguing is what is wisdom? The theme of what wisdom is, how we get wisdom, how we acquire knowledge, is nowadays called epistemology. I have been saying for many years that one of the most important skills, maybe not the most important skills, and based on how the world is speeding up, changing, and what is happening right now, is the ability to acquire a new skill fast and well enough so that someone would be willing to pay for that skill. This is exactly a key area of Entrypoint Academy. After all, who among us would not want to be able, like in the movie Matrix, learn coding software in a week and have a salary of a developer? And because I'm interested in the area of rapid learning and understanding new material, Plato's storyline about epistemology of how to acquire knowledge was extremely attractive for me. Wisdom knowledge is prominently addressed by Plato in the dialogues Theaetetus and Meno. In the dialogue Meno, there's a very interesting example. In the dialogue, Socrates advocates the theory that our soul knows everything prior to being born and forgets everything after coming into the world. This is proven, among other things, by the fact that there are concepts that the soul has always known, and that knowing and the acquisition of knowledge is in fact the recollection of knowledge already acquired before birth. This theory, which may or may not make sense to some according to one's creed and beliefs about what is before and after life, is demonstrated for me by a beautiful example. Socrates takes a simple slave who has no knowledge and shows how, by skillful questioning through dialectics, leads this absolutely uneducated slave to understand how to make a square that is twice the size the area of the original square. Just try it out for yourself on paper and then look at the dialogue of Meno and think about it. How much you already know, but you don't realize it's in your head. And it doesn't matter if you had it before you were born, or whether you had this information in your brain and did not know you had it or how to find it. It's basically the same thing as when I was looking into cancer and diabetes and have been able to discover long-standing connections that to me and probably to our society had somehow mysteriously remained hidden. It's the same as when millions of scientific papers were given to artificial intelligence to analyze, and the AI was able to find in a moment discoveries hidden from the human mind just by analyzing those papers and connecting the information in them. Ultimately, the question is whether we can attain wisdom by acquiring knowledge. Since we all know people who are walking encyclopedias, but we don't find these people wise at all. I will discuss this in the final segment, whether one can educate oneself to be wise regardless of how much one knows or how high your IQ is. Certainly an interesting pointer at the right direction is the phrase, "All I know is that I know nothing." A whole lot of dialogues deal with general matters one faces but doesn't address. What is a beauty? What is friendship? How moderate one should be? For example, with beauty, the question is whether beauty can be defined. Is it possible to specify what all beautiful objects have in common? These are apparently trivial questions, but they teach you how to think about things and not let your mind form mindless connections. This thinking also leads you into a mode in everyday life in which you mentally question and evaluate thinking and the information that comes to you. Today, this is called critical thinking. And just by reading Plato's dialogues, you, without knowing, develop these skills. In a number of dialogues, Socrates interacts with young people. Apart from the theme of homosexuality between the elderly and young men, which appears in the dialogues and at least makes you think about the development of social norms, how something that is almost unimaginable today could once have been seen as a completely ordinary thing. Plato also demonstrates how Socrates behaved to the youth, what he communicated to them, and how he guided them, because as you remember, Socrates was charged for corrupting the youth. This is the beauty of the dialogues. Apart from the houses, the neighborhoods, the characters, and the various connections, you just have a whole series of big and subtle themes that you are only really able to notice when you read several dialogues. These hidden dimensions slowly begin to reveal as you read along. A beautiful dialogue that I have to mention is a symposium. Symposium was a drinking party, and at this party, participants decided each give a speech on the subject of love. I expected that through each protagonist's speech, there would be a view of love, and then Socrates would give his view. But instead, Socrates recounts what a prophet Diotima told him about love, and Socrates then talks about love as 5 steps. I can say that the different steps have once again showed me some interesting insights into love, and certainly by reading the symposium, I have discovered new insights into how I myself perceive love. For me, however, the most significant line that has completely influenced me are the dialogues Sophist, Statement, the Republic, and the Laws. In the time of ancient Greece, there was a group of people who were called the Sophists. They were people who traveled around Greece and taught skills for money, especially rhetoric and persuasion. Rhetoric in the time of ancient Greece was very important because a lot of disputes and situations could have been solved by skillful argumentation. For example, there was no anesthesia in those days, and so it happened many times that a doctor recommended an operation, but the patient was afraid of the pain. In such situations, the doctor could have hired a clever sophist who could then talk the patient into the surgery. Socrates and Plato didn't like sophists. They thought of them as clever manipulators who pretended to have wisdom, but they just used others to get money out of them. That's why the most common clients of the sophists were wealthy politicians and wealthy businessmen. In the dialogue Protagoras, Socrates measures his strength with the existing historical figure Protagoras. Protagoras is the author of a statement with which I absolutely agree, and that is that the man is the sum of everything. And this is still true today. Everyone behaves as they are. Everyone has been shaped by genes, upbringing, environment, and life situations. I really enjoy this dialogue because in it, one watches an argumentative clash between two personas that I both respect. The same in the dialogue Gorgias, another great rhetorian in which there is a great clash between Gorgias and Socrates. Gorgias was Socrates' arch-enemy, and so it's interesting how Plato presents this clash. The dialogue Sophist takes on a whole different dimension for me. At the moment you imagine that the sophist is something like today's PR consultant, lawyer, or a politician. Once you understand who the sophist of today is, then you go into the dialogue Statement with even more motivation. This dialogue seamlessly follows the sophist. In it, Socrates discusses how a true statesman should behave so that under his leadership, society flourishes. Thinking back on the hundreds of political meetings I have had with politicians, I thought this should be a required reading for all candidates to understand what politics is and how to approach it, so that a politician knows how to behave and what their responsibilities are. In both dialogues, 3 types of leaders are compared: the sophist, the statesman, and the ultimate, the philosopher. That's why I was looking forward to the announced 3rd dialogue, philosopher, who was supposed to be an even more perfect statement. But Plato never wrote this 3rd dialogue. But did he really not? Actually, from my point of view, he did. And that in Plato's greatest work, the Republic. In the Republic, which consists of 10 books, Plato describes how to create a utopian society. When I read this dialogue and dismissed proposals which, from today's point of view, would be obsolete, the Republic contains for me quite fundamental insights. Already mentioned Plato's boat, which points to the problem of democracy and offers solutions to overcome the fact that it is very difficult for voters to choose a true expert to lead a country. Next is, of course, the very familiar concept of Plato's cave. In it, Plato describes a model in which prisoners are locked from birth in a cave and can only see it in front of them. Behind them, there is a light source where various objects are placed, and these form shadow patterns on the cave wall. The prisoners know only the shadow stories on the wall and take them as a reality. But this reality is only an imagined indirect reality of the shadow sources behind their backs. I find this concept absolutely fascinating. Aside from the fact that someone wrote it 2,400 years ago, it's so fitting for today. We are prisoners who perceive reality through media, But it's not reality, it's just indirect reality. This passage to Republic is interesting not only because of this model, but it also describes what happens when one of the prisoners breaks free, but more than that, what hardships this prisoner has to go through when he subsequently returns to the other chained prisoners to explain this. It's the same as we experience today when you try to explain to one camp on the internet a different view of what they stand for, and we see it all globally today as our society divides into different camps. In the Republic, Plato describes the principles of how to approach the creation of the state and the relationship between the individual and the state, because the two are connected by an umbilical cord and must work in harmony. Plato's last dialogue, The Laws, for me complements the Republic beautifully. In the Laws, Socrates is not present, but a young unknown Athenian walking around Crete, where a new colony is about to found it. The whole 12 books of this dialogue describe how and why to make laws so that this colony can flourish. Again, some things are now outdated, but as throughout Plato's work, this book teaches you how to think about the creation, development of the state and access to the law. This book teaches you how to think about the creation, development of the state and the importance of the law. To me, a beautiful concept in the laws is that a law is not to be just a command, but the law is to be such that citizens understand why that law helps to develop society and why they should obey it. Therefore, every law has to contain a simple explanation that explains the law to the common man so that everyone is motivated to obey it, because they will understand that the law is for their own good. With that, I would conclude this section, and in the next segment, I will describe insights that each dialogue has given me, how I apply them in everyday life, and how they have influenced my view of business, reality of life in the 21st century. Most importantly, how it convinced me that I have to start Project Entrypoint Academy. The last segment contains a section on dialectics and how to apply it in your work life and when interacting with loved ones. A section on how to gain knowledge, how to rapidly learn, how to acquire a new skill well enough so someone is willing to pay for it. A section on how to filter information and apply critical thinking so that you are immune to the manipulation by others and the media. But considering how much time it took me to create the previous segments, I decided to make the last segment upon request. So if you are interested in this last segment, email me, and if there are enough people interested, I will happily create the last segment then. Thank you for your attention.